want to welcome those who are joining us for the Wednesday evening Bible study. This is the Moorhead Church of Christ, and we are studying through the book of Judges. And I just want to apologize in advance. I'm having some throat issues. Don't know if there's something in the air. That's what I'm assuming. Fires are around us where we're at, and I think it's affecting my throat. So if I clear my throat, I'm going to try to do it sparingly. So that you don't hear that the whole time. So I just want to let you know that I may be doing that from time to time. We are in Judges chapter 9, and you'll recall that at the end of chapter 8, the Midianites, essentially because of Gideon's help as a judge, were subdued for some 40 years. And there was peace from Israel's enemies, and everything sort of looked pretty good. And then Gideon died, and after he died, the Bible says that the sons of Israel again became really spiritual adulterers against God. And we have in the book of Judges kind of an unusual chapter with chapter 9. We've been busy talking about that cycle where they're walking with God, they start to get away from God, they fall into sin, they fall in the hands of their oppressors, they cry out to God, God sends them a judge to rescue them, life is good till they restart that cycle. In between that judge, Gideon, and the next judge in chapter 10, we have sort of a side note here, but it obviously has importance. It is actually the son of Gideon through one of his from his concubine in Shechem. And I believe that the reason why this is recorded in here, obviously by this time the sons of Israel have left walking with God, that this is recorded here because this is really an attempt to have a king without any authority from God. In other words, Abimelech is going to essentially take it upon himself to be the first king of Israel. And so we might call him the unauthorized king of Israel. And that's exactly what takes place in this chapter. And so we're not going to reread all of chapter 9. We're going to start in verse 30. But you'll recall that Abimelech goes to Shechem, and Shechem must have been a notable city. He essentially says, hey, I'm your flesh and blood here. His mother was from Shechem. He was born in Shechem. And, you don't want to have 70 men to rule over you. You could have just one. Besides that, I'm your own flesh and blood. And so he really is the one that sort of manipulates them or talks them into appointing him king. And after he's appointed king, he is given some 70 pieces of silver. What he does, he goes and hires, the Bible says, worthless and reckless men. These men really help facilitate really the death of all 70 of his sons who, if there was, would have some kind of right to the throne that he occupies. He's essentially eliminating all of them. And so not only is Abimelech guilty of this great wickedness, but also the men of Shechem. You recall that one of the brothers got away, and his name was Jotham, and he really told that fable, and it was really about what had happened with the fact that Israel wanted to have a king, and remember Gideon turned him down. And eventually you have this Abimelech, and he becomes this bramble that becomes king. And the story is told essentially because Jotham is saying, you really haven't done the right thing in regard to my father Gideon. Really, you've done the wrong thing here. And essentially, there is going to be a curse that comes upon you for the great evil that you did. And essentially, the evil, it comes out in verse 23, it says, then God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the men of Shechem, and the men of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech. And remember, we talked the fact that God is not evil. God, there's no darkness within God. God is all light. The idea that when we see this in Scripture, we need to recognize that this doesn't mean what a lot of people think it means, but it's really talking about how God essentially used the situation that was at hand there between Abimelech and the men of Shechem, and essentially there was a falling out. The Hebrew word there in verse 23 about an evil spirit is really about a bad temper and anger. So they're unhappy with Abimelech. Maybe everything was going well at the beginning, but there's sort of a falling out with Abimelech, and God really just uses this situation to really undo all of what has been established. And as we continue to look at the text here, we recognize that the men of Shechem, in verse 25, are trying to set up an ambush to kill him. Eventually, this guy named Gael shows up in verse 26 with his relatives. And Gael, he is somebody who wants to be king too. You don't like Abimelech made king? You know what? If I were made king, I'd take care of this guy. What right does he have to be king? And he's saying all these things. And he said, Abimelech should just, verse 29, just increase his army. Well, let's go to battle. Let's settle the matter once and for all. And then verse 30, it says when this is where we're at, I guess. So we won't talk about any more of it. So we're here at verse 30. You'll recall that Zebul is one of the lieutenants, verse 28, of Abimelech. He's one of his officers, and he actually lives in Shechem. And he's heard these sort of proud and arrogant words of somebody who is advocating revolt from this Gael. And so he sends messengers to tell Abimelech. And so this is where we're going to begin tonight. Jenna, if you don't mind reading for us 30 through 33.
Okay. And when Zebul, the ruler of the city, heard the words of Gael the son of Ebed, his anger burned, and he sent messengers to Abimelech deceitfully, saying, Behold, Gael the son of Ebed and his relatives have come to Shechem, and behold, they are stirring up the city against you. Now therefore arise by night, you and the people who are with you, and lie in wait in the field. And it shall come about in the morning, as soon as the sun is up, that you shall rise early, and rush upon the city. And behold, when he and the people who are with him come out against you, you shall do to them whatever you can.
All right. So this Zebul guy, we don't know how he got appointed to the position they have, but he seems to be somebody who's loyal to Abimelech. Maybe everybody else essentially is ready to throw Abimelech under the bus, so to speak. But Zebul, he is somebody who's loyal to Abimelech. And not only that, he seems to be a fairly smart guy in terms of what the king should do. And so here in verse 30, it talks about Zebul. He obviously is not happy about what's been spoken here. It says his anger burned. And the New International Version said he was very angry. In other words, we're talking about the stirring of emotions. He heard this. You kind of get the impression that, he's just hot. He is upset about this, right?
Is he supposedly the mayor or something? Because it said the ruler of the city. Is that the mayor? Or?
I mean, it seems like he's in a position, something like that, where he has some kind of authority on behalf of Abimelech over the city there, which seems strange that this guy would be saying all this stuff. It's like, hey, he pointed it out as being one of his lieutenants in verse 28. It seems strange, but then if you essentially know that you have a significant amount of people that essentially maybe have, behind the scenes expressed discontent, then, there's sort of safety in numbers, and maybe that's why he was basically saying this publicly.
Could he been one of the people that he hired early on or something too? The unscrupulous people?
I think that's a possibility. But we just don't know. We don't really know how he got to be where he got, but it obviously seems that he was somebody that would be familiar with that city. Probably one of his mother's relatives. You got me into kingship. Here's what I'm going to do for you. Yeah, so could be something like that. Verse 31 says, he sent messengers to Abimelech deceitfully, saying, Behold, Gael, the son of Ebed, his relatives have come to Shechem. Behold, they are stirring up the city against you. You know, in ancient times, this is just a real no-no. If you're going to be a king, this is one of the things you're constantly concerned about. You're concerned about those close to you, trying to, you know, pull off a coup attempt. You're concerned about other stuff going on there. And if you're going to essentially preserve yourself as the king, you essentially got to rule with an iron hand. So what Abimelech's going to do is really harsh, but you know, in ancient times, if you're a king, you don't rule because you're a nice guy. You know, that you're essentially, you allow a lot of misbehavior to go unpunished. Essentially, if this gets out, you've got to do something about it because essentially you're being challenged.
It's like a revolt, basically.
Yeah, it's a revolt. And so obviously he is going to have to do that. So Zebul secretly notifies Abimelech via these messengers about this rebellious speech spoken by Gael about, you know, challenging his right of rule over the people. Verse 32 says, "Now therefore arise by night." This is Zebul speaking, and in the message given to the messengers to Abimelech, he says, "Now therefore rise by night, you and the people who are with you, and lie in wait in the field." So Zebul is not only saying, "Hey, Abimelech, there's trouble in paradise. You've got a big problem here. This is where essentially you became king. But here, let me tell you what you can do in order to sort of rein all this in, to take care of it." So he gives wise counsel to the king, essentially really to put down this revolt and preserve his kingship. And it seems that Abimelech is certainly all ears. He essentially recognizes that that these are words of wisdom that will help him to put down the revolt. Verse 33 says, "In the morning, as soon as the sun is up," so Zebul is saying this, once you travel there by night, as soon as the sun is up, rise early and rush upon the city, and behold, when he and the people who are with him come out, that's talking about Gael, against you, you shall do to them whatever you can. And so you need to get in place. You can't sit on this. You need to get there. You need to get in place. And the best thing you do is get there by night, get set up, and as soon as it's daybreak, then essentially that's when you're going to launch an attack against Gael and the forces there in that city. And it appears that this is a military tactic he's sharing with Abimelech, that only a portion of the troops really are to come out. So imagine they come up and here's these troops and like, "Hey, there's Abimelech's troops. All right, go after and get them." And essentially what you're doing is staging an ambush. In other words, you have a certain portion that are showing, and you have others in other places that are hiding so that you don't have a reluctance maybe to come out. And so this seems to be the case here. They would maybe assume that, well, the men that we see are the entire army, so let's go out there and have a battle with them and we'll defeat them. However, as I mentioned, this is an ambush, and so once Gael and the men of the city came out of the city, the rest of Abimelech's men would come out of hiding and join the battle. Remember, he's going to talk about the 4 companies that Abimelech had. In other words, he didn't have all of his men in the same place. He's essentially going to take down this Gael, because this Gael seems to be somebody who's a big talker, and he seems to think that he is strong enough to defeat Abimelech, but Abimelech, you know, with the help of Zebul, is really going to have the upper hand. Any questions about any things we talked about there? Okay, Timothy, would you mind reading for us 34 through 41, please?
Okay. For 34. And Abimelech rose up and all the people that were with him by night, and they laid wait against Shechem in 4 companies. And Gael, the son of Ebed, went out and stood in the entry of the gate of the city. And Abimelech rose up, and the people that were with him, from lying in wait. And when Gael saw the people, he said to Zebul, "Behold, there come people down from the top of the mountains." And Zebul said unto him, thou seest the shadow of the mountains, as if they were men. And God spake again and said, See, there come people down by the middle of the land, and another company come along by the plain of Menomim. Then said Zebul unto him, Where is now thy mouth? Where wilt thou see us? Who is Abimelech, that we should serve him? Is not this the people that thou hast despised? Go out, I pray now, and fight with them. 39. And Ger went out before the men of Shechem and fought with Abimelech. And Abimelech chased him, and he fled before him. And many were overthrown and wounded, even unto the entry of the gates. 41. And Abimelech dwelt at Harumah, and Zebul thrust out Ger and his brethren, that they should not dwell in Shechem.
All right. So, as I said, Abimelech really heeds the words of Zebul here and does what he recommends. The idea of laying in wait, the NIV says took up concealed position, so it kind of gives you a better idea of what's going on. And he's talking about 4 companies, and the Brown Driver's Big Hebrew Lexicon is really talking about a division of an army. And so you have a group of soldiers. So you essentially take your army and divide it in 4, and you're basically stationing them in different places in order to pull off this ambush that they're not really expecting. So 35 says, Now Gaal the son of Ebed went out and stood in the entrance of the city gate, and Abimelech and all the people with him rose from the ambush. So all of a sudden, really Gaal's worst nightmare sort of comes to light. In other words, your words have consequences. You were talking this big stuff about how Abimelech doesn't deserve to be a king, and hey, let's go into battle with one another. Well, all of this is essentially going to unfold, and it's happening right then and there. In verse 36, it says, When Gaal saw the people, he said to Zebul, Look, people are coming down from the tops of the mountains. But Zebul said to him, You are seeing the shadow of mountains as if they were men. And so remember that Zebul had sent these messengers to inform Abimelech of this revolt by Gaal. It's interesting that Gaal pointed him out as a lieutenant or an officer that was under his authority in verse 28. And it, I'm sorry, go ahead.
From here, from what we just read, I think Gaal should know that Zebul is one of the officers to Abimelech. So that means, to some extent, Gaal and Zebul, they are also very close. If he allow an officer who is a kind of holding position under Abimelech to be with him when he's preparing for war, when he's preparing to face Abimelech, and he allowed him with him, because from what we read, while he was preparing for the war, Zebul was with him.
Yeah.
He told Zebul, I see people coming. That means they also get prepared to face Abimelech together. That means to some extent they are very close too.
Yeah.
So if he should allow, I don't know how.
Yeah. Well, here's what seems to be the case is that Gaal essentially has the wide support of that city. And even though he notes that Zebul is a lieutenant or an officer belonging to Abimelech, it appears that Gaal thinks, well, Zebul is staying here with us. Maybe he's come around to our way of thinking. He hasn't left. And so maybe, he's with us. He's going to go along with us. So he notes that he belongs to Abimelech, but he is, in order to have somebody that belongs to the enemy that close to you, you either have to be very naive or stupid, or you have to come to the belief it's like, well, he really didn't say anything. Zebul doesn't say, hey, wait a minute, this is against the king, don't have anything to do with this guy. He doesn't come out and say, hey, Gaal, I'm your best buddy, I'm with you, or anything like that. But it seems to be that Gaal is sort of thinking that he maybe come around to their way of thinking. I mean, I don't know how else you could be that close
Yeah.
without making some kind of accommodation. Like, you know, if I knew he was somebody who belonged to the enemy, essentially he could know what we're going to do, where we hide men, where vulnerabilities are, whatever it may be. It'd be dangerous to have somebody that close to you if you didn't believe he was friendly to your cause. Yeah. So that, I mean, otherwise it just seems odd that if Gael knew that he was a true loyalist to Abimelech, it'd be so odd to have this guy that close to you. Okay, yeah, right.
I was just gonna say, at this point, it just seems like Gael is in over his head.
Well,
Like, he may have said, "Hey, I would do a good job," and it's like now he's seeing, I probably shouldn't have said what I said.
Well, and we can sort of see that Zebul is no friend, because, you know, Gael is saying, look at, you know, there's mountains nearby, and he says, I can see movement on the mountain. There's some kind of troop movement nearby in a mountain. And Zebul is, hey, hey, you're just seeing the shadow of mountains as if they were men. In other words, you're just seeing things. But it's not actually that. We think about, you know, why is Zebul doing that? And that's really not to, you know, really alarm Gael too much. You know, the idea is, you know, if he thinks it's men, then he might say, hey, get some guys and do this or do that. But if he's sort of saying, oh, don't worry about it, you're just seeing things, that gives more time for these men who are coming down this mountain to sort of get into place and everything like that. So we know that Zebul is really not a friend to Gael. And so he is really telling him, you know, basically you're seeing illusion, but yeah, you're not really seeing what you think you see. So 37, Gael spoke again and said, behold, the people are coming down from the highest part of the land, and one company comes by the way of the diviner's oak. Now your translation reads a little bit differently, and the New American Standard uses the word diviner's oak, and Brown Driver Briggs translate this word from the Hebrew as practicing soothsaying. The NIV calls it a diviner's tree, and the Amplified Bible uses the same phrase that you had, the oak of Menomenim or something like that. And that Menomenim, if I'm pronouncing it right, means the sorcerers. In other words, it's a notable tree in that area where sorcery occurs. So it's like, you know, it's like if we're describing something downtown and somebody is somewhere new there, and we draw a point at some key element downtown and say, oh, you'll know you're close by when you see this. This is kind of what's being done here. He's using that as a sort of a point of location in this in explaining here what's going on. Gael did not fall for Zebul's deception of the soldiers of Abimelech coming down from a nearby mountain as illusion. Gael did not accept Zebul's explanation for what he was seeing, because he knew he was really seeing troops. Okay? And here's the part that I get kind of tickled with here. Verse 38, then Zebul said, so everything is unfolding that quickly. He said, Zebul says, where's your boasting, Gael? With what you said is, who is Abimelech that we should serve him? Is this not the people whom you despise? Go now and fight with them. You're a big talker. You know, it's sort of like Zebul has been quiet all this time, really had been nonchalant, sort of maybe acting like a friend of Gael, really trying to reassure Gael that he's not seeing what he's seeing. And at some point, it seems like he can't contain himself. He said, all right, big talker, go for it. And so this is exactly what's happening. He says, now go fight your fight. And that goes back to verse 29 when he challenged Abimelech. Verse 30 says, so Gael went out before the leaders of Shechem and fought with Abimelech. Verse 40, it says Abimelech chased him, that's Gael, and fled before him, and many fell wounded up to the entrance of the gate. And so right away we see that the tables turn right away against the men of Shechem and Gael. Verse 41 says, then Abimelech remained in Arumah, But Zebul drove out Gaal and his relatives so that they could not remain in Shechem. So the fight went really bad. The battle went really bad for Gaal. Gaal seems to have survived it. There seems to have been an element left, but Zebul essentially is responsible for driving out whatever of the men that they had left, driving them out of the city. And so even though Gaal may have talked a good talk, he essentially was not much of a match for Abimelech. Bob Winton, in his commentary on an outline commentary on Judges, says, quote, Zebul thrust Gaal and his people from Shechem. It may be that when they tried to re-enter the city, Zebul sealed it against their entry. Abimelech dwelt in Arumah, but the fortunes of Gaal are not specified. If he escaped death and capture, as seems to be the case, he was forced to some other locality, unquote. This will be the last mention of Gaal, and so we've talked about this before. It's like, well, whatever happened to this guy? The Bible's not interested in telling us about, what happened to him. It's an interesting thing that we'd like to know the rest of the story, but it isn't something we need in terms of what the Bible is designed to give us. And so we don't know. He was a big talker. He thought he could dethrone Abimelech, but in the end, he was more bark than bite, we might say. Okay, if there's no questions about that, Ryan, if you want to read 42 through 45.
Okay. Now it came about the next day that the people went out to the field, and it was told to Abimelech. So he took his people and divided them into 3 companies and lay in wait in the field. When he looked and saw the people coming out from the city, he arose against them and slew them. Then Abimelech and the company who was with him dashed forward and stood in the entrance of the city gate. The other 2 companies then dashed against all who were in the field and slew them. Abimelech fought against the city all that day, and he captured the city and killed the people who were in it. Then he razed the city and sowed it with salt.
Okay, so this is kind of an interesting thing. So remember that when Abimelech first showed himself with his troops and Gaal was there was some kind of battle that happened there. But the battle sort of ended up with not everything being done. In other words, it seemed like the city gate was closed. Seems like at some point we talked about Zebul driving Gaal out with whatever elements he had left, but there were all of the people that were there still behind. And maybe they thought after this battle, Abimelech sort of packed up and went home because they're acting as if everything is okay. Why would you leave the city walls and go out and work and do agricultural work outside the city wall where you have no protection, unless you sort of think, well, everything must be taken care of. Now we can kind of pick up and move on with our lives. And that seems to be the case here. So what Abimelech was going to do, he didn't do it all in one day. And so what we have here is that Gaal had really a price he had to pay for advocating revolt against Abimelech, and the men of Shechem paid a price for aiding Gaal in their revolt. But now, this is going to be really revenge on the rest of the inhabitants of Shechem, because they're going to pay a price for having their part in that revolt as well. And so the people are out there doing, as I mentioned, they're out in the field doing agriculture work. They're vulnerable because they're outside the city walls. And so now it's an opportunity for Abimelech to sort of reap havoc on the people that still remain there in the city. So verse 33 says, so he took his people, he's talking about his army, divided them into 3 companies, and lay in wait in the field. When he looked and saw the people coming out of the city, arose against them and slew them. So something about the idea is people are coming out, so they're beyond the walls, and those people coming out to go into the fields, the idea is they sort of take them out, is what's going on here. Verse 44 says, then Abimelech and the company who was with him dashed forward and stood in the entrance of the gate, and the other 2 companies then dashed against all who were in the field. This word dashed to me is kind of a strange word in the New American Standard, but the Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew Lexicon means to put off one's shelter or to make a dash from a sheltered place. So wherever they're at, they're sort of springing out of it. their hidden positions, and then they're launching their attack. And so now they're attacking everybody by the city gate. They're essentially sealing off the people that are on the field from retreating back into the city. And then the other two companies essentially are going to kill everybody who's already out there in the field. So, we're talking about the slaughter of hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people. And so this is exactly what Abimelech does. This is really extracting revenge. His kingship has been challenged by this Gael guy, and he stirred up the people, and now everybody's going to pay because he's the king, and he's going to make sure that nobody takes him off of his throne. Verse 45 says, Abimelech fought against the city all that day, and he captured the city and killed the people who were in it. Then he razed the city and sowed it with salt. Razed here, the Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew English Lexicon, the idea of pull down, to break it down, literally pulling structures down. We're just going to demolish the city, right?
You're probably going to get to it, but I assume the sowing the salt basically makes it like, infertile. It's basically like they desecrated that whole city, like nothing will ever grow there.
Yeah, that's really what it is, making it uninhabitable.
Yeah.
And Nelson's Illustrated Bible Dictionary says, during times of war, the enemy's lands were sown with salt to render them barren. In other words, if you really want to get them, it's not just about killing all the people and burning the city down. You put this salt out there, and it really is a disincentive for anybody to sort of want to come in there and rebuild, because it's going to take a while for that salt to, essentially the effect of that salt to wear off.
Must have been a plentiful resource to have.
Yeah.
All right, bring out the salt, boys.
Well, remember they have the Dead Sea. I mean, they have to go a little bit of a distance to go there, but that salt would have been something that would have been widely used in the Palestine area. So yeah. So, yeah, very good. Okay, Jenna, would you read for us, please, 46 through 49?
When all the leaders of the tower of Shechem heard of it, they entered the inner chamber of the temple of El-Bereth. And it was told Abimelech that all the leaders of the tower of Shechem were gathered together. So Abimelech went up to Mount Zalmon, he and all the people who were with him. And Abimelech took an axe in his hand and cut down a branch from the trees, and lifted it and laid it on his shoulder. Then he said to the people who were with him, What you have seen me do, hurry and do likewise. And all the people also cut down each one his branch, and followed Abimelech, and put them on the inner chamber, and set the inner chamber on fire over those inside, so that all the men of the tower of Shechem also died, about 1,000 men and women.
Okay, so this is kind of unusual with what we have here with the Bible writer. The Bible writer has already concluded really the battle that's taken place, and really the extermination of all those who were left as inhabitants of Shechem and destruction of the city. And now he mentions this other event. And so the Bible writer is not always concerned about chronological order. We are modern people. We like everything in order. Did you know all the books of the Bible are not in chronological order, but they are grouped according to the kind of books they are. So, but they're not chronological order. For instance, Job is one of the early books of the Bible, and it belongs under the patriarchal period, and so it should be up there during the time of Genesis, and really before the time of Moses. And yet it's grouped together with poetry or wisdom literature. So the Bible is actually, books are grouped together really based on a theme. So that shouldn't surprise us when we get into text, and sometimes something's mentioned here and we think, okay, so and then we hear something over here, and that really goes back to here. It's an element that the writer didn't mention here, but now mentions here. And sometimes that's confusing to us because in the modern era, we sort of want everything just laid out in time order, because to us it's easier to understand. But that doesn't mean that the Bible writer has done anything wrong, right?
Do we know why the Bible was put in the order it was? Like you just talked about Job should be like close closer to Genesis.
Yeah.
Do we know why it was put?
Well, because the Hebrews lumped them together in groups of books. So you have, the Pentateuch,
Yeah.
5 books of law, and then you go from there. Right after, that, you have really the books of history, Jewish history or Israelite history, and after that, they put all the wisdom literature together, Job through the Song of Solomon, Song of Solomon. And so the idea is this in ancient times seemed like a more, according to the way that they saw things, a better way to sort of group the books of the Bible when they dealt with them.
Is that kind of the same thing for the New Testament too then?
Well, yeah, because you have the gospel account. They weren't all written at the same time. The Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all written in the 50s and 60s AD, and John's not written until 90s. But the ones that are grouping the ideas is this goes over here. So the ancient Hebrews sort of grouped the Old Testament books. I'm not sure about the New Testament books, if that's sort of more of a when that was sort of figured out how they would go together. But you have the Gospels, and then you got Acts, the history book. Then you have all of Paul's writings, and then you have the general epistles, and then you have the Apocalypse. And that's just how it was decided. And maybe the New Testament was decided based on how the Old Testament books were grouped together. So, but that's good. So what we're doing is now we're going back to when Abimelech and all the stuff that was going on in Shechem. So that's what's going on here in verse 49 or 46 to 49. And it's talking about the leaders here in verse 46 of the Tower of Shechem. They heard of it, okay, that they entered the city, the inner chamber of the temple of El-Berith. The temple of El-Berith is a pagan temple dedicated to Baal. And when they heard of it, there must go back to verse 45, the idea that he destroyed everything and the city and all that, but this temple must still have been left standing. And now we're going to see what happens to this, that this temple must have been something that Abimelech was initially didn't want to bother, disturb, or put off till the last minute to deal with everything. So remember that a tower was erected for defense, and so a lot of ancient cities had towers, so you'd have people posted there, be able to watch for enemies coming towards the city. That was your early alert system, so that you could get together troops and fight off the bad guys, all of that. But the tower, a lot of times, was tied to the wall of the city, but it doesn't say that they were in tower, but they entered the inner chamber of the temple of El-Berith. And it appears that they essentially went into this. Perhaps this was a well-built structure, this temple of El-Berith. Perhaps they felt it afforded them protection, that they could have a better chance of surviving and fighting off Abimelech in there. Perhaps maybe they thought, well, this is this pagan temple is somewhat sacred, since we've turned away from God, this is our new God, surely maybe Abimelech will overlook this temple and he won't do anything to it. But essentially they were wrong in their estimation. They probably just needed some place to be able to get shelter from Abimelech. Verse 47 says, it was told to Abimelech that all the leaders of the Tower of Shechem had gathered together. So somebody found out that they were in there. It's told to Abimelech. And so Abimelech went up to Mount Zalmon. Mount Zalmon is a wooded mountain near Shechem in Samaria. And he and all the people were with him, and Abimelech took an axe in his hand, cut down a branch from the tree and lifted it and laid on his shoulder. Then he said to the people who were with him, what you have seen me do, hurry and do likewise. You can tell we're sort of in an ancient culture. We wouldn't probably, say, bring them and say, okay. All right, now you've seen what I did. I'm giving you I'm giving you an example. Okay, you guys do that. We just say, everybody grab something, cut off a limb, break off a limb, and let's go. We're going to bring this over here. And of course, their desire is to use that as fuel around this temple, and one of two things are going to happen. They're going to start on fire, and those people are going to bail from that temple. When they come out, guess what's going to happen? We're going to just execute when they come out. Or if they stay in, it's not going to end well for them. But either one way or the other, we're not going to have to try to break in there where they got positions of advantage in there and defending it. We'll just cut to the chase. We'll just set the building on fire. All right, verse 50 through 57. Timothy, would you like to read that?
Okay. 50. Then went Abimelech to the Tibet, and encamped against the Tibet, and took it. But there was a strong tower within the city, and thither fled all the men and women, and all they of the city, and shot into them, and gat them up to the top of the tower. And Abimelech came unto the tower, and fought against it, and went hard unto the door of the tower, to burn it with fire. 53. And a certain woman cast a piece of a milestone upon Abimelech's head, and all to break his skull. Then he called hastily unto the young man, his armor bearer, and said unto him, Draw thy sword and slay me, that men say not of me, a woman slew him, and his young man thrust him through, and he died. 55. And when the men of Israel saw that Abimelech was dead, they departed every man unto his place. Thus God rendered the wickedness of Abimelech, which he had did unto his father, in slaying his 70 brethren. Okay, 57. Sorry, 57. And the evil of the men of Shechem did God render upon their heads, and upon them came the curse of Jotham, the son of Jerubbaal.
Okay, very good, thank you. So just real quickly, when we read all this and somebody says, you know, the Bible is just a bunch of stories that people made up, does this read as some kind of nonfiction, something that isn't true? You've got people's names mentioned, you've got places mentioned, and everything seems very realistic in the accounts that are given. When we look at a lot of the stuff, archaeology, you know, the Bible hasn't found evidence of everybody that's mentioned or every place that is mentioned in the Bible, but everyone that they have found evidence of their existence, all of the stuff they found fits with what was said about that person, where they were and so forth, and everything in terms of the places that are mentioned, they're in the locations where they were mentioned in the Bible. And so archaeology is our friend. Archaeology is not something that works against us, but it really proves that, you know, these people actually lived. There were people that believed for the longest time that the Hittites were not a people. They said, oh, you know, somebody, you know, that's just the Bible. And, you know, it really just, it wasn't really true. And then, you know, this was early, I don't know if it's the early 19th century. They were sort of naysaying maybe around the beginning of the 19th century. By, I don't know, 20s or 30s, they came up with evidence of the Hittites. They stumbled upon a complete library, ancient library of the Hittites with all of their language and stuff. So it isn't as if we have to say, well, if we don't find evidence that people exist, they didn't exist. You know, before the modern time, when they didn't have good record keeping, sometimes you go to the cemetery and there are people buried there like, well, who is that? We don't know. We don't have the records. You know, the records are lost. We have no idea. You know, so, but just because we can't find the records that somebody existed or a place existed, doesn't mean that they didn't exist. It just means we don't have any record of their existence. So we want to look at this last part here. I appreciate Brother Timothy reading that. It talks about Abimelech going to Thebes, and he camped there against Thebes and captured it. Now, the Bible writer doesn't really tell us why, but we must assume on the same basis of Shechem that these guys have somewhat, you know, had joined that revolt against Abimelech. Otherwise, it doesn't really make any sense. Like, I'm going to just go up there because, you know, I want to attack them and conquer them. Well, if you're the king of that area and everybody is essentially following you, why would you attack them? Okay, so they must have joined in the revolt, even though it is not specifically said. Thebes was a fortified city in Manassas, and it was something that obviously Abimelech seen as a threat and somebody, people that he had to deal with. Verse 51, it says, "But there was a strong tower in the center of the city, and all the men and women with all of the leaders of the city fled there and shut themselves in, and they went up to the roof of the tower." In other words, you know, if you have no way of winning, then this must be your only strategy, is you better get somewhere and hide, and you know, maybe you can get in certain locations as people try to break in. That's your best bet in trying to stay alive. And so this is very similar to what we've seen with the men of Shechem going into the temple there to Baal. Verse 52, "So Abimelech came to the tower and fought against it, and approached the entrance of the tower to burn it with fire." So it makes us wonder if these people even knew what happened to Shechem, because you're thinking, you know, the guys in Shechem tried the same thing, getting in the temple to Baal, and you know, Abimelech set it on fire. I'm not sure this is a good idea. So we might get the idea that this is, and we don't know how long after this happened, but seeing that they didn't have phones and internet and all that other stuff, it must have happened in fairly short order in order for them to sort of ignore or not have any knowledge of what happened when they went into the temple of Baal. Here they're going into this other structure, and Abimelech's going to, hey, this worked the first time. I'm not going to fool around with these guys. We're just going to start it on fire. Verse 53 says, "But a certain woman threw an upper millstone on Abimelech's head, crushing his skull." So that was a crushing blow, and that really is going to be the end of Abimelech. Millstones were those stones that were cut and used to grind grain. You know, they're in kind of a husk, and the idea you have to use some kind of measure to process it to be able to get the seed for flour. And so you would put, and I'm reading from Nelson's Illustrated Bible Dictionary here, flat stones in which grain was placed and crushed as other stones rolled over the grain. And this is what happens. So the idea is that you roll over enough, it breaks it free. You can essentially gather all of that, all of the flour there. It says one type, there's a couple other larger types where it's more industrial, but in order to explain the stone this woman used, it must be sort of a smaller setup, maybe one that a household used or multiple households used in their community, but it was made of two round flat stones. A wooden peg was firmly fastened in the center of the bottom stone, and the upper stone, which had a funnel-shaped hole through the center, was placed over the peg. Grain was poured between the stones and around the peg through the hole, and the upper stone was turned by a peg handle placed near the outside edge, crushing the grain. So that's kind of how they did it. So aren't we glad we can just go to Walmart and buy it or wherever? We don't have to worry about doing all that stuff. Arthur E. Kundal and Leon Morris in the Tyndale Old Testament commentary on Judges and Ruth are talking about the Hebrew word here, upper millstone or millstone, said that the word shows that it was normally about 2 or 3 inches thick and 18 inches in diameter with a hole in the center. That's why we know that it must have been a smaller outfit, because this woman picks it up. You got some that essentially, animals are used to pull a stone around on it. So it is one that she's able to pick up. And what's being described here is really a humiliating defeat of an evil man. The idea is sort of like earlier on in the book of Judges, where, I'm trying to think of the names of woman, but she put the tent peg through his head. The idea that you're this strong, you're this warrior, and that you got taken out by a woman would be a very humiliating way to die. Okay, because the women are the weaker sex, and so the idea in ancient times, that's pretty humiliating when a woman beats you. And this is sort of the idea, is it'd be a humiliating way to die because you want to die in a battle with a man fighting away or whatever, and he takes you out, you die that way. But for a woman to put a tent stake in your head or drop a millstone on you, that would be a humiliating way to die. So Verse 54, Abimelech's still around, and you're just thinking this guy just had, from whatever distance that was, this millstone hit his head. And, he kind of like, he calls him, goes, draw his sword and kill me. He obviously knows it's a fatal blow, so that it will not be said of me, a woman slew me. So the young man pierced him through and he died. And so that's the end of Abimelech. When the men of Israel saw that Abimelech was dead, each departed to his home. This was something that demoralized the troops. Just like cutting the head off the snake. The snake, what else? The snake's not going to be much if the head's gone. These guys essentially, they were going to fight against Thebes and capture it. And after Abimelech is killed, they have no fight left in them to finish the job. They all just go home. But here's the interesting thing that after reading all of what we read in chapter 9, it says, thus God repaid the wickedness of Abimelech, which he had done to his father in killing his 70 brothers. And also God returned all the wickedness of the men of Shechem on their heads, and the curse of Jotham, the son of Jerubbaal, came upon them. Now let me ask you this. We don't have a lot of time left. We're actually a little past due. How is God involved with this, what happened here? Did God make, the men of Shechem rise up against Abimelech? Did God make, Abimelech, did God was responsible for killing Abimelech and killing all these men of Shechem? Was God directly involved with that?
Directly.
Okay, sort of more indirectly, right?
Directly.
What's that?
I say indirectly. God was involved indirectly.
Yeah, indirectly. So, and it really goes back to verse 23 when we see that God sent an evil spirit. Remember that the Hebrew word describes bad temper, anger. This is basically something has happened between Abimelech and the people of Shechem. God didn't cause this. There was a falling out. Why? We don't know, but there's a falling out. But sometimes it's spoken as if God was the cause. Just like we read about Pharaoh, it says, God hardened his heart. Well, God didn't make Pharaoh harden his heart. God put Pharaoh in a position that he knew Pharaoh would harden his own heart by saying, who do you think you are, Moses? I'm the king of Egypt. These people aren't going anywhere. So we've got to recognize that sometimes the Bible writer puts that, but he's not accusing God of doing evil, nor is he saying that God acted above their free will. He essentially used the situation to his benefit, we might say. Okay, and that's what we have here. And so all of what happened with this between Abimelech and the men of Shechem, essentially, God used that, because imagine if Abimelech was able to have a greater grip and strength on the whole, on all of the 12 tribes. Really, God is sort of reining this in through, what's happening with the men of Shechem and Abimelech. God used that to really, destroy this rule of King Abimelech. But I want us to think, with the little time that we have left, just a little time here, is think about why, all of this occurred with these people to begin with. And I think if we go back and we were to look at the end of chapter 8, what we see is when they got away from worshiping God and serving God to serving idols, any kind of evil can happen. This was Abimelech was Gideon's son. The idea is once you go off into evil, then you can become an evil person. And a lot of things that are happening are because the people weren't following God. And all of this is really things that didn't have to happen. And if they'd have been a different kind of people, the people that essentially were following God after Gideon had won their freedom from the Midianites, it'd have been a different story. And so I think the lesson we look at this is that, evil happens sometimes when we're not committed to God. If we're not committed to God, we're really going to invite evil in our life. We're going to participate in evil. And so it's important to keep our lives holy and pure and recognize that we're here for God's purposes. We're not here to serve ourselves. Abimelech was not about, trying to help God's people or essentially be a blessing to God. He was all about himself. And he acted really in selfishness and arrogance, and really, the wages of sin is death. Eventually, his evil caught up with him, and God sort of reined it all in through this situation. So, unless there's any questions or comments, we're going.
I have one question. Did they have helmets in those days, or?
I'm sorry, they had what?
Did they have helmets?
Hummus?
Helmets.
Helmets, okay. Helmets. They did have crude helmets. Some of them did to some extent. They realized the benefit of that. I mean, as time goes, just like the automobile industry, the first car is a horseless carriage with, something that you do like this. As it gets better, we have very crude helmets, just like in early football, they had real basic helmets, and you compare that to ones they have now. They had very crude helmets to sort of protect their head. They weren't obviously near as good as the ones that were later developed, but they had to have that, because your head is an important part that you want to preserve from the enemy getting you. So I want to thank those who will be watching this video. Hopefully it'll be encouraging to you as you read through the book of Judges. You recognize how much better it is to live for God, to recognize, that if we're living for God, we're going to do what's right. The people of God are going to want to do what's right, and everything is going to be better for the God's people and the kingdom. God bless you.